Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well and welcome to yet another edition of Late Night Reviews with Jean. Yes, this is yet another review that I am filming in the middle of the night. Although it has been a while since I've done one of these, to be fair, I have gotten better at scheduling, but still this week is a busy one, so I thought I'd sneak in this review now, and that means I do need to be a little bit quieter whilst filming this video because everyone around me is sleeping. But aside from all of that stuff, I just watched Moon Knight on Disney Plus. Let's talk about it. So Moon Knight is the latest in a long line at this point of MCU Disney Plus series, and this one stars Oscar Isaac as the titular character, and the episodes are directed by Mohamed Diab. Now I would venture to say that Moon Knight is the nichest or most niche comic book character that the MCU has dared to introduce to the masses, especially within his own projects. I do feel like going into this series, a lot of us were blind because we didn't really have a lot of information based off of the character, because a lot of us have never heard of Moon Knight before. Like, I don't know about you, maybe some of you guys have heard of Moon Knight, to be fair, okay, but I for one had never heard of Moon Knight before. Like, he literally just came out of nowhere, so I had very few expectations for, you know, the series and where the series would go in terms of its direction, the themes and characters that would be explored here. But I was very pleasantly surprised to see the introduction of this character and the exploration of the themes that they do delve into in this series, and I found myself very much enjoying this new MCU series. Just a spoiler for this whole review, but I had a good time. I had a good time with this show, okay? I do think it's yet another success story in the MCU Disney Plus lineup, and we are going to delve into all of my thoughts on the series overall in this review, as well as that finale. But before we get into all of those thoughts, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. And also follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter if you want to hear more of my thoughts on movies and TV shows that I don't talk about here on this channel. But without further ado, let's get into my review of Moon Knight. So first of all, as I said, Moon Knight is a very niche character, although even he is not as niche as El Muerto's Sony. Anyway, I allowed this series to be my guide on this character rather than going through a bunch of YouTube videos and checking out all of the cameos and references and Easter eggs in the series on a weekly basis. I did all of that with WandaVision and a lot of the series from last year, but I found myself a little bit fatigued from that, and also I found that it sets up these expectations for where the show is going to go, and when the series doesn't meet those specific expectations, sometimes the show overall is judged as being disappointing or underwhelming, or, you know, etc. and so forth, as we saw with WandaVision. So ever since that experience, I've kind of been pulling back from all of that and allowing the series to just tell me what it wants to tell me and allow me to get to know the character that it wants to portray. And that was incredibly important when it came to the character of Moon Knight, because this is an incredibly complex being. Here at the center of this story, we have a hero that ultimately deals with a lot of mental health issues. One of the main ones being DID, dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. Now, the last time I spoke about DID here on this channel, it was with a lot of annoyance, it was with a lot of anger and disappointment, because I was reacting to the Netflix series Ratched, and in my Ratched review I expressed how just disappointed and angry I was that the showrunners and the writers clearly had no idea how this condition works, and they'd clearly done no research, or if they had done any research they'd clearly ignored it, because the way that this mental health issue manifests in one of the characters on that show was just factually inaccurate or improbable. Whereas in the case of Moon Knight, you can definitely see a difference in the way that they wanted to handle this character, this main character who has DID. And I cannot speak for, you know, the community, and I cannot speak as a professional either because I am not one, but I will say that I could definitely see a difference in the deference and respect that is paid towards the character of Moon Knight and all of the identities that encompass him versus the character that we got, whose name I can't even remember at this point, but in Ratchet. Now, I also will say on the topic of mental health, since it is such a central focus in this series, I was really impressed by how the series combines, you know, the topic of mental health and having a central character who suffers from DID with this mythological lore and this idea that you have this Egyptian god called Khonshu who is controlling this person who has multiple identities, and he is using his fragile mind, as it were, in order to manipulate him into doing his bidding. I think that's a fascinating concept, and of course this is a concept that comes from the comics, so not all credit goes to the series and to Jeremy Slater for adapting them. I do think it's such a clever way of incorporating a real life issue that is underrepresented in media into a world where you can explore ancient Egyptian mythology, where you can explore superheroes and powers and all of that. And I think it speaks to the trends that we are seeing a lot in these Disney Plus series, first of all, of the exploration of mental health, can I just point out, because this is certainly not the first time that we've seen this be explored. We saw it in WandaVision, we saw it through the character of the Winter Soldier in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, we saw it with Loki to some extent, so we really have been delving into mental health quite a bit. I think I made the joke last year that Disney Plus is the place where the B characters go to get therapy, to get the therapy that they desperately need after the shenanigans of the main MCU. Not only do we have that as an ongoing trend in these Disney Plus series, but also being able to explore such topics in long form storytelling is very beneficial. You know, these are things that we can't really dive into in a 2.5 hour movie, but when you have a 6 episode series, you can do this topic justice, and I think that's why these kinds of topics are explored in these Disney Plus shows and why they flourish there. On the flip side of this series, as I mentioned, we do also have the ancient Egyptian mythology being explored here, and you know, I absolutely love ancient mythology. I love Greco-Roman mythology. I love Egyptian mythology, although I'm less familiar with it, and this series was very educational on that front. I love Norse mythology. Like the idea that these, you know, comic book franchises, whether it be through the Thor films, the Wonder Woman films, would explore this ancient mythology through the lens of superheroes, you know, comic book movie heroes. I think it's a great idea. I love that idea. I've always said I wanted more. I've always said I wanted like a Greco-Roman mythology based franchise. You know, Percy Jackson could be it, although I personally love the first Percy Jackson film, so I'm not one to complain when it comes to Percy Jackson adaptations unless we get into the sequel of that film, okay? But I do think that having this kind of mythology as part of a franchise is an ingenious idea, because it is a built-in world, a built-in universe that you can dive into with like countless amounts of characters. The potential the potential to mine from this incredible storytelling from literally thousands of years ago is endless. Anyways, so we do see that be represented and touched upon here in the Moon Knight series. This time around we're going down the Egyptian route, and again I learned so much. I learned so much because I was less familiar with this mythology, and also it just made for a whole change of scene. Like, this is so distinctly Moon Knight. No other series, you know, no other franchise looks like this, where it dives into ancient Egyptian mythology, whilst at the same time also representing modern day Egypt in this more kind of realistic and authentic light. On the week that episode 3 dropped, I remember a lot of people mentioned that how refreshing it was to see that Egypt wasn't portrayed with this like yellow filter. I believe they called it the piss filter. But it's true, like a lot of films and TV shows, when they go into places like Egypt or, you know, deserts, they will have this kind of filter on them portraying them as if they're extraterrestrial, as if they're, you know, alien, as if they don't belong on this same earth with the rest of us. But here we had a very authentic portrayal of modern day Egypt, as well as the exploration of ancient Egypt. And this was really key to me, especially because most recently, for those of you who have seen my video talking about franchises I simply don't care about, franchises I don't care about, one of those franchises, spoiler alert, was Indiana Jones, and I discussed my moral issues when it came to that franchise and the depiction of, you know, Egypt mania. The idea that you have these, you know, Caucasian characters, these archaeologists going in to explore places like Egypt and kind of ram through their precious artifacts and, you know, their history, their culture, and take it and, you know, export it elsewhere so they can be displayed to thousands in a museum far, far away. You know, I have issues with how that is depicted in franchises in particular, like Indiana Jones. It's not always Egypt, but the sentiment is still very similar, and it stems from colonial roots. And whilst I do think that Moon Knight was treading on very delicate ground when it decided to tackle Egyptology, I think for the most part they did so in a very respectful, reverent manner. It didn't feel colonial, especially through characters like May Kalamaui, who is of Egyptian descent. You know, it doesn't feel like other people coming in to steal from this culture and this history. It feels like, especially through her character, she is going in to discover her own history, in the history of her own ancestors, and she and her father shared in this passion and in this reverence to do so. Now, before we get into the character specifically, as I've already talked about some of the themes and aspects of this series that I really enjoyed and appreciated, I did just want to delve into some of the criticisms that I had when it came to the show. We're just going to run through them, okay, and then we're going to get into the characters, okay? So first of all, I will say, for a series that is called Moon Knight, for a series that is called, you know, Moon Knight, where he at? Like, actually, like, where is Moon Knight at? Okay, that's my first criticism. He's not in the series that much. Now, I will say the suit is cool. The suit is banging. The suit is hot. Like, it's very unique. Again, like, no one else looks like it. You cannot say that Moon Knight wouldn't stand out from a crowd, because he absolutely would. And it's not just because he is literally bright white, but yeah, he is a really aesthetically cool character, and the scenes that we do get with him are quite impressive. I wouldn't say the action sequences blow my mind though. You guys know how I feel about action sequences, especially in these Disney Plus shows. I did a comparison video comparing Loki, WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier last year, where I talked about the importance of the action sequences, and to this day I don't think that Falcon and the Winter Soldier has been beat, even though there were some cool sequences with bows and arrows in Hawkeye. When it comes to the hand-to-hand combat, guys, I don't think it's strictly the actor's fault. I think it may also be a time sensitivity issue, and also just like an investment issue. None of these hand-to-hand combat sequences come close to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, if I'm being honest, let alone Captain America and the Winter Soldier, and let alone like a Daredevil. Oh my god. Please, there are moments where you see a hint of what could have been, especially in Moon Knight, where you're like, oh, that was cool. And in the finale as well, there's that scene where he slides on the car and he has this, like, these moon daggers, these crescent daggers that he stabs people with. That was nice. That was a nice touch, but I needed more of that. I needed, they were giving me more swords. They were giving me little drippings, little portions of that specialness. I needed more. And so as it stands, I would have to dock points when it comes to action sequences, but that's even beside the point, because the guy, you know, my guy Moon Knight is barely in the series. He's barely doing the missioning that everyone keeps talking about, you know, that Khonshu has him doing. So I would say that this series would have definitely benefited from a couple more scenes of Moon Knight doing his missioning, going on his missions for Khonshu. And also, on a more technical note, I will say that the realization of Moon Knight as a character was a little bit inconsistent because of the CG. I do think that there are some moments moments of just exceptional special effects on this series. And I do take issue with people generalizing and saying that the CG on the series overall was terrible. I wholeheartedly disagree. There are moments where the CGI, or you know, the special effects look photo realistic. Okay, first of all, Khonshu I think is realized spectacularly. I think Khonshu looks insanely good, and I suspect it has something to do with the textures at work here and how the light bounces off of them. Because Khonshu is the skeletal figure, for some reason he just looks very convincing, you know, as a CG character, especially his head. You know, some of his gobs look a little bit at times, but his head looks real. You can't tell me you can't tell me Khonshu does not look good, especially in daylight. Like, it's not like in, you know, the darkness of night. It's in daylight that he looks good. That's very impressive to me. And not to mention, you have that scene in, I believe, episode 3 or 4, where he's changing the night. He's going back 5,000 years. That was amazing. That was beautiful cinematography brought about by, of course, special effects. So I don't want to hear this story about, oh, the CG in the show is bad. No. No, don't start with me, okay? But I will say, when it comes to Moon Knight, when it comes to his suit, especially when he's suiting up and all of the kind of, what are they called? All of the strips of mummy fabric are going on him. I do think that the CG looked a little bit obvious in those moments. And also we saw a similar thing with Layla. Oh God, I believe I referred to the character as the actress earlier on. My apologies. Layla is her character in the show, but she suits up as well in the season finale, and I do think that the CG for that was a little bit wonky. But honestly, I would have to say that the most egregious case of dodgy CG would have to be with some of the Egyptian gods. And I noticed, like I said, it's a texture issue. Because with the god Taweret, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing these Egyptian names. But with the god Taweret, who is the hippo god, she looks a little bit off. Like, she looks like a video game character. And again, I do think it has something to do with perhaps her proportions, but also perhaps the texture of her skin just doesn't really work well with the CG that they use there, so it looks very animated. And a similar thing ultimately with Amit, you know, when we see her appear at the very end of the series as this crocodile figure, again, the texture of that skin looks a little bit rubbery. It doesn't look photorealistic. And so yeah, it does feel like they are video game characters, which is a shame, because I actually wanted to see the real life, or like the realizations of the Egyptian gods earlier on in the series. So yeah, overall, CG is a little bit wonky. It definitely does a disservice to Moon Knight when he's kind of coming into his costume. I will say though, there are no issues or no concerns when it comes to the character of Mr. Knight. I think the CG for that character is realized beautifully. And the suit is also stunning as hell. He actually has my favorite costume, okay? I just think he looks dapper, he looks handsome as hell, even through his mask. He just has that he has a vibe to him that makes him really, really cool. And honestly, it never really made sense to me that he was supposed to be Steven. Like, to me, it would have made more sense if, say, Jake had looked like Mr. Knight, because Jake is supposed to be a quite aggressive, cool character. So it was kind of odd that Steven was like underneath that cool exterior. But I guess by the end of the show, it does make a little bit more sense. Okay, so now speaking of all of these different identities within Moon Knight himself, let's talk about each of these individual characters. So the first character that we're introduced to in the series officially is Stephen Grant. Now, Stephen Grant is this like Londoner he's this Londoner who is working at the National Gallery, I believe it is. He's working at the National Gallery at this like Egyptian exhibit. We have Stephen Grant, who isn't a researcher at the gallery or anything. He works at the gift shop, you know, and even though he is really, really passionate about Egyptology, he's really passionate about ancient Egyptian myths and gods, and he has this like thirst to want to teach people people about it. You see him educating these young kids, you know, when they're visiting for a school trip. But because of his life circumstances and the nature of his mental health condition, it seems as though, you know, he has been prevented. He has been held back from pursuing a career in this chosen field, you know, in this field that he's really passionate about. It is a really interesting choice that the series made to introduce us to the character of Stephen first of all. You know, it's something that we take for granted, but they could have just as easily chosen to depict this story through the lens of Marc Spector, the cooler character. But the fact that we have the more vulnerable identity, you know, the fact that we have Stephen, whose life is impacted by having DID, by blacking out and not realizing what he's doing half of the time, what his body is getting up to, I think it made for a really touching and moving story, especially when you go in later down the line and discover the backstory of this person and what they went through in childhood. It just kind of comes full circle. Now, whilst we're on the topic of Stephen Grant, we of course have to talk about his accent. His accent wasn't the end of the world, guys. His accent wasn't the end of the world, and also it made sense in the end, in the context of the story, why his accent sounds like that. But as a Londoner myself, I must say, okay, if you go to certain parts of London, like the East End, you know, you will see or hear someone who sounds like Stephen Grant. Oscar Isaac said that he was inspired by the Jewish community in Enfield. Maybe they sound like that, I don't know. But you will find or hear people who sound like that in London. So like, it's really not that out of the blue. So yeah, and also, like I said, it makes sense in the context of the story because of the way that this identity was manifested. But it's early on in the series that we get an explanation for why Stephen's life is so strange, why he's experiencing these blackouts, why he can't seem to trust himself to go to sleep. And it's because he is not the only identity existing within his body, because in comes Marc Spector rocking his world, rocking his entire existence, because it turns out that Marc Spector has a mission. He has a duty to be Moon Knight in service of the Egyptian god Khonshu. Now, I absolutely love the way that the character of Marc was introduced on the show, just contrasting the relatively normal and, you know, pedestrian life that Stephen Grant lives with this like crazy, you know, horror-filled, just existential existence of Marc Spector. It was really, really cool. And especially that scene that you get with Stephen Grant, you know, in the lift, and all of a sudden you see Khonshu popping up in this like long hallway, and he comes closer and closer as the light turns on. That is ingrained in my brain. That is ingrained in my brain. It was such a sick scene. But this series plays a lot with mirrors. It plays a lot with the imagery of fractured glass and reflections, just kind of reflecting the fractured mental health state that Stephen Grant has. And so you have this introduction of Marc Spector through this glass, you know, through this mirror. He's speaking directly to Stephen, demanding to get control of the body because Khonshu has a mission for him. At first, their relationship is quite antagonistic, as you can imagine, because they have, you know, very different motives. You know, Stephen just wants to go ahead and live a regular life. He didn't know anything about this Khonshu ancient Egyptian stuff. He just thought that a lot of his issues surrounded his inability to go to sleep and to trust himself when he does go to sleep. But in reality, there were bigger problems at play here, and they all started with the character of Marc Spector, who turns out to be the kind of original identity of this person. And the dynamics between Steve and Marc are further expanded upon in episode 5, which I think is one of the most emotionally impactful, just so gut-wrenching, so powerful and poignant episodes in all of these MCU Disney Plus series. I would say episode 5 of Moon Knight is up there. Okay, it is up there in the top 5s, okay, because it was truly just gut-wrenching. Seeing the backstory of Marc Spector, seeing how in his childhood he had a younger brother and he had accidentally led him towards this cave, which ultimately ended up with him dying, and his mother grieved his younger brother. His mother resented him for his involvement in this whole ordeal, even though it hadn't been his fault, and she blamed him his entire childhood and abused him. Oh my goodness. And this goes back to what I was saying about the representation of DID being so much more accurate in Moon Knight, because DID is a condition that tends to stem from childhood trauma, from trauma that people experience as children before they have been able to cement their identities, as it were. And this tends to happen before the age of like 10 or 12, where these are the ages that you would kind of cement your identity and your persona for the rest of your life. So the ages line up, the experiences line up. I'm not saying that this is the most realistic series ever and this is a great source if you want to learn about DID. Obviously not. It's a fictional show, but it's just miles better to what we saw from Ratchet, for instance. And I just found it to be so profound and so heartbreaking. This is the MCU, right? This is the MCU that everyone accuses of being really light and funny and lacking of substance, but this series, I think what was most profound when it comes to the relationship between Marc and Steve is that ultimately Marc wanted to protect Steven. Marc wanted to protect, you know, this identity who represents a happier version of his childhood, a more naive and blissfully ignorant version who was never exposed to the pain and the abuse and the trauma that Marc had to deal with when he was younger. You know, when he experienced that abuse from his mother and quite frankly the neglect from his father. Let's not forget that there are two parties involved here. He had to create an alternate in Steve in order to survive. You know, this is a form of coping mechanism that his brain used in his childhood in order to allow him to survive the abuse that he was going through. And so the fact that as Marc grew up and he did find himself in the hands of Khonshu under his service, that he still wanted to protect Steve even after all those years was really profound to me. It was really touching to see that ultimately that's what he was driven by. And I think it was also somewhat for selfish reasons as well, because he wanted just that one part of him to remain pure and remain blissfully ignorant. But I also think it was because he saw Steve as this, you know, younger child from his own youth that he wanted to protect from all of the evil in the world. And sticking to this topic, before we get into the full discussion of the end credits scene, I do think that Jake Lockley, the third identity in this person, is the kind of extra layer of protection. He is supposed to protect Marc from the horrors that he sees whilst he's doing mercenary work. So he may have been an alter that was developed later on in life. So overall, at the core of this series, we have the exploration of the development of the relationship between Marc Spector and Stephen Grant, and I think it's actualized beautifully, especially when we get to episode 5, when we see the backstory. We get a better understanding of, you know, how these characters came to be, how they were forged, and it just makes for a really touching and emotional insight into this character. But as great as the writing is, I would of course be remiss if I didn't mention how exceptional Oscar Isaac is at portraying this character. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oscar Isaac literally, he ate and left no crumbs. Like, I'm so sorry. Oscar Isaac as Moon Knight, mwah, genius casting, genius portrayal. The way that he was able to bounce back and forth from each of these identities was masterful. There were moments where, especially in the finale, he's saying a single line, a single sentence, and he's like all of these different personalities. It was incredible to watch, to be able to see this one actor portraying these two distinct people, these two distinct identities convincingly. Wow. Wow, like truly exceptional work. So he gave it his all, you can definitely tell, and I think the series was all the better for it. So the next character that we're going to be going through is Layla. So Layla is Marc's ex-wife, or I believe they're still married actually by the end of the series. They don't sign the divorce papers, but she had a relationship with Marc that kind of broke down, again because of the issues surrounding Marc's circumstances, you know, being an indentured servant to Khonshu will do that to you. But I really loved the character of Layla throughout this series. I think she was so refreshing and so wonderful to have here. Obviously, it's great to have that female representation and also to have a female Egyptian hero at the center of this story as well, which was highlighted in the finale quite heavy-handedly, but it is a point. Okay, points were made. I think it's wonderful to have that kind of representation, and that's something that Mohamed Diab actually pushed for, which just shows once again the importance of having not only representation in front of the camera but behind. Anywho, Layla is a babe. Like, Layla is Layla was doing bits. Okay, she had a great personality, she was really skillful, and then at the very end there, where she becomes an avatar for Tauret, she was really convincing in those action sequences. Again, they weren't the best choreographed sequences, and again, I didn't love the way that her costume was realized CG wise, and also, okay, I'm being such a hater, but I didn't love the costume design either. We could have spiced it up just a little bit. We could have spiced it up just a little bit, given us something truly exceptional. But in the case of Layla's costume design, I would say it's one of the weaker ones. So sis could use an upgrade, okay? And I believe that there could be a follow-up to this series, despite what everyone else is saying. Please, I have eyes. There could be a follow-up to the series, so maybe we'll see sis get an upgrade in the sequel. And next up we have Arthur Harrow, who is portrayed by Ethan Hawke. I think it's amazing, first of all, that Ethan Hawke is in an MCU series. Like what kind of time are we at? It's a wild time. His main mission is basically to resurrect Amit, who is a goddess of like vengeance or something. She basically punishes people for wrongdoings, not just after they have committed them, but also before they get the chance to do so. You know, she's kind of like the Minority Report. She prevents future wrongdoings from happening, but of course that robs people from free will, and robs them of the ability to choose, you know, to make those decisions in their lives as to whether or not they do those things. So she's the bad guy. And there is a discrete difference between her and Khonshu, which I find very interesting. The idea that you have these two sides of the same coin battling it out. And we're actually formally introduced to her in the finale, although like I said, she kind of looked like a video game character because of the CG, in my opinion. Eventually, Harrow is able to become the avatar for Amit, even though he doesn't technically pass her test because his scales are unbalanced because of all of the dirty work that he did when he was the avatar for Khonshu, and the fact that he enjoyed that stuff. So he is a character who exists in the grey area, and he himself, you know, he's preaching all of these things and condemning people who have wobbly scales to the point where people are actually dying at his feet because of his ability to test their moral compass. But he himself this entire time had wobbly scales. We should have seen it coming because, like I said, he was an avatar for Khonshu. But I do think that it's interesting that he himself is not a hypocrite, and that's why he's only one of the bad guys. He was prepared to die at Amit's feet when he was able to resurrect her. You know, he was convinced that she was going to kill him, that she would, you know, stay true to her beliefs, to her doctrine, to her dogma, and kill him because of his wobbly scales. You know, he had hoped that maybe resurrecting her would redeem him somewhat, but he was prepared to die nonetheless. But she was the one who was like, I actually like the fact that you're a loyal servant and will do whatever I say, so like, I'm gonna keep you alive. It speaks to the nature of these gods, and that's something that we see on the flip side as well, where we get into the character of Khonshu. Now when it comes to the character of Khonshu, guys, I have some mixed feelings, if I'm being honest. Okay, let me explain, right? So when he's first introduced, he's terrifying. He was terrifying. I'm a scaredy cat. Like, hi, I'm Jean, I'm a scaredy cat. So I couldn't handle the scene where he was introduced in that hallway, coming closer and absolutely not. That terrified me, okay? So at first I was like, I hope we don't see a lot of this Khonshu guy. But then when he started talking to like Marc and Steve, when he started having chats with them, especially when they were in Egypt, he seemed like a pretty chill guy. I actually liked Khonshu, like low-key. I was like, hang on, I kind of like Khonshu. Like, I kind of like him as a character, even though he's evil, even though he's manipulating Marc Spector, you know, using the fact that Marc has DID and his mental state is very, you know, fragile, as he puts it, in order to get him to do his bidding, and knowing that he is this ruthless killer whenever he needs him to be because of that third identity in particular. So yeah, he's a trash character. Like, he sucks. Khonshu sucks, it must be said. But a lot of characters in the MCU suck. And he's kind of awesome at the same time. He has a swagger to him. And also, I must say, F. Murray Abraham, who voiced the character, did an exceptional job. His voice is perfect for Khonshu. His voice was as perfect for Khonshu as Jeffrey Wright's voice was for the Watcher. Like, just genius choices all around. So yeah, I actually like the character of Khonshu, especially in episode, I think 4, where he seems like a bit of an underdog, especially against the other gods, guys. Like, the other gods were being really mean to him, being like, oh, you can't change the skies and go back in time 5,000 years in front of all of the other humans. And he was like, and they locked him up. And I was like, that's a bit cruel. Like, we don't need to do that, okay? Those other gods were useless, by the way, truly useless. They said they're supposed to, like, spectate, but in reality, they did nothing at all. Khonshu literally went there to the tribunal or whatever and told them that Harrow is a bad person, something fishy is going on, and they decided to trust this human that they literally do not know over Khonshu just because they have beef with him. That was petty as hell, and look where they ended up. Oh, I hated those other gods. It was so useless. But yeah, going back to my emotional roller coaster when it comes to the character of Khonshu, so I started really liking him, and then when he was trapped, you know, imprisoned again for changing the skies in one of the most beautiful sequences in the entire MCU, I was really sad. I was really upset, and I actually kind of missed him in episode 5. But then he comes back in the end credits scene. Let's discuss the end credits scene, where we are finally introduced to the third identity, Jake Lockley. And this is through a scene where we see Harrow, who wasn't killed at the end of the finale. You know, Marc decided to, you know, make Khonshu do his own dirty work for once, get his hands dirty. And so he refused to kill Harrow. And we're all like, good for you, Marc. Even though he kind of would have been justified. It's Harrow we're talking about. And it's not like an innocent bystander, whatever. He decided not to kill Harrow. And so we're all thinking, oh, good for you, Marc. And then in the end, we see Harrow in a mental health hospital. Then we see him taken away by this mysterious figure with a cap on. We know who that is. If you've been on Twitter on Wednesdays, you know who that is. See him be taken away, and Jake Lockley stuffs him in a white Rolls Royce limousine, which Khonshu is inside. And it's Khonshu himself who introduces Harrow to the third identity within Marc Spector's body before he turns around and he looks completely unrecognizable, even though it's still Oscar Isaac. Like, imagine that. How did they do that? He looks unrecognizable, but he turns around and shoots Harrow right in the face, I guess, or in the chest, and that's the end of that. Like, we have finally met Jake Lockley. I would say another critique of this series is that they waited way too long to introduce the character, in my opinion. I wonder how people who had no idea about Jake being a third identity reacted to this reveal, because I only knew because of people banging on about it on the timeline. Okay, on the TL on Twitter. I was anticipating some kind of reveal in the finale much earlier, if I'm being honest, especially during the action sequence in the finale where we see Moon Knight be overwhelmed by all of these people, and you're thinking, how the hell is he going to get out of this? And then all of a sudden they flash and everyone's dead and the problem is taken care of. I think that was a bit convenient. Like, I wanted to see him transform into Jake Lockley and have a whole different costume and then battle it out. Like, I wanted that to be the introduction to the character, but instead they kind of put it in this after credits scene, which I think was a bit disappointing. But again, I wonder how people who had no idea about this character at all reacted to that, because, you know, would it mean anything to them? Did they catch the hints and clues to the fact that that there was a third person or third identity in the body. I don't know. So yeah, if you're one of those people, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts down below. But yes, at the end it is shown that ultimately the big bads of Moon Knight are the Egyptian gods, and in particular Khonshu, and the way that he has been using Marc's Spector, because both Marc and Stephen had made it very clear what they had wanted. They didn't want to be avatars for Khonshu any longer, but he didn't give them a choice. He literally took that choice away from them, and that just makes him irredeemably evil. And it's just such a heartbreaking scene, you know, even though we're surprised by the revelation of Jake Lockley being canon in the series. Ultimately it's a tragic ending to the show because Marc Spector never got full agency of his body. And so with all of that being said, and boy was it a ton, I'm going to be giving Moon Knight a 7.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Moon Knight, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of the series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.